twilight had settled across the mountains, painting the jagged horizon in shades of purple dusk. The winding blacktops snaked through the gathering darkness, surrounded by shadowed hills that towered into the cloudless sky, stretching towards the first faint glimmerings of starlight. Leon might have appreciated the majestic view a bit more if he wasn't so goddamn late. He'd make it to his shift on time, sure, but he'd been hoping to get settled into the new apartment first, take a shower, get something to eat. As it was, he might have time to hit a drive-through on his way to the station. Changing into his uniform back at the last rest stop had saved him a couple minutes, but basically he was screwed. His shift started at 9, and it was already just after 8. Leon let his boot ride a little heavier on the gas, even as his Jeep whipped past a sign that told him he was half an hour away from Raccoon City. At least the road was clear. Except for a couple of semis, he hadn't seen anyone for what felt like hours. A nice change considering the traffic tie-up just outside of New York that had cost him most of the afternoon. He'd actually tried to call the night before, to leave a message with the desk sergeant that he might be late, but there'd been something wrong with the connection. Nothing but a busy signal. What little furniture he had was already moved into a studio apartment in the working class, but basically decent Trask district of Raccoon City. There was a nice park not 2 blocks away, and it was only a 5-minute drive to the station. No more gridlock, no more overcrowded slums or random acts of brutality. Assuming he could survive the embarrassment of showing up to his first shift as a full-blown officer of the law without having unpacked his bags, he was looking forward to living in the peaceful community. Raccoon is about as far removed from the Big Apple as you can get, thank you very much. Well, except for the last few months. Those murders. In spite of himself, he felt a tiny thrill at the thought. What had happened in Raccoon was horrible, of course, sickening, but the perps had never been caught, and the investigation was really just getting started. And if Irons liked him as much as the heads of the Academy had liked him, maybe Leon would get a chance to work on the case. Word had it that Chief Irons was kind of a prick, but Leon knew his training had been top-notch. Even a prick would have to be a little impressed. He'd graduated in the top 10th, after all, and it wasn't like he was a stranger to Raccoon City, since he'd spent most of his summers there as a kid, when his grandparents were still alive. Back then, the RPD building had been a library, and Umbrella was still several years away from turning the town into an actual city. But in most ways, it was still the same quiet place he remembered from his childhood. Once the cannibal killers were finally put away, Raccoon would be ideal again. Beautiful, clean, a white-collar community nestled in the mountains like a secret paradise. So I get settled in, and a week or two passes, and Irons notices how well written my reports are, or sees how good I am on the target range. He asks me to take a look at the case files, just to familiarize myself with the details, so I can do some footwork, and I see something that no one else has seen. A pattern, maybe, or a motive on more than one of the victims. Maybe I run across a witness report that reads wrong. No one else has caught it before. They've lived with it for too long, and this rookie cop just comes along and cracks the case. Not a month out of the academy and something ran in front of the Jeep. Jesus! Leon hit the brake and swerved, shocked out of his daydream as he struggled for control of the vehicle. The brakes locked, and there was a screech of rubber that sounded like a scream. The Jeep half turned to face the darkened trees that lined the road, and came to a stop on the shoulder, dying after a final, lurching jolt. Heart pounding and stomach in knots, Leon opened the window and craned his neck, scanning the shadows for the animal that had darted across the highway. He hadn't hit it, but it had been close. Some kind of a dog. He didn't get a clear look. A big one, anyway. A shepherd. Maybe an oversized Doberman. But it had looked wrong, somehow. He'd only seen it for a split second. A flash of glowing red eyes and lean, wolfish body. And there was something else. It had seemed kind of slimy? No, trick of the light. Or you were just so shit scared that you saw it wrong. You're okay and you didn't hit it. That's the important thing. Jesus, he said again, softer this time, feeling both relieved and suddenly quite angry as the adrenaline leaked out of his system. People who let their dogs run loose were idiots, claiming they wanted their pets to be free, then acting surprised when Fido got squashed by a car. The Jeep had come to a stop just a few feet away from a road sign that read, Raccoon City, 10. He could just make out the lettering in the growing shadows. Leon glanced at his watch. He still had almost half an hour to get to the station. Plenty of time. But for some reason, he simply sat for a moment, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. Cool, pine-scented air breezed across his face. The deserted stretch of road seeming almost unnaturally quiet, as if the landscape was holding its breath, waiting. Now that his heart had resumed a more normal pace, he was surprised to find that he still felt unsettled, even anxious. The murders in Raccoon, weren't a few of those people killed by animal attacks? Wild dogs or something? Maybe that wasn't someone's pet dog at all. A disturbing thought, and even more disturbing was the sudden feeling he had that the dog was still close by, maybe watching him from the darkness in the trees. Welcome to Raccoon City, Officer Kennedy. Watch out for the things that may be watching you. Don't be an asshole, Leon muttered to himself, and felt a little better at the sound of his no-nonsense adult tone of voice. He often wondered if he would ever outgrow his imagination. Daydreaming like a kid about catching bad guys, then inventing killer dog monsters lurking in the woods. Let's try to act our age, eh, Leon? You're a cop, for God's sakes. He started the engine and backed onto the road, ignoring the strange sense of unease that had somehow managed to take hold of him in spite of his mind's chiding voice. He had a new job and a nice apartment in a nice little up-and-coming city. He was competent, bright, decent-looking. As long as he kept his creativity glands in check, everything would be fine. And I'm on my way, he said to himself, forcing a grin that felt out of place, but suddenly necessary to his peace of mind. He was on his way to Raccoon City, to a promising new life. There was nothing to be uneasy about. Nothing at all. Claire was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and the fact that her butt had been aching for the last couple of hours wasn't helping matters much. The thrum of the Holly's engine seemed to have settled deep into her bones, a physical counterpoint to the butterflies in her stomach. And of course, the worst of it seemed to emanate from her extremely sore and overheated ass. Plus, it was getting dark, and like an idiot, she wasn't wearing her leathers. Chris would be totally pissed. The Harley buzzed along the dark road, the sound of the engine echoing back at her from the sloping hills and shadow-laden trees. She took the corners carefully, very aware of how deserted the winding highway was. If she took a spill, it could be a long time before anyone happened by. Like it would matter. Take a spill without your gear on, they'll be scraping pieces of you off the asphalt with a squeegee. It was stupid. She knew it was stupid to have left in such a god-awful hurry that she couldn't be bothered to suit up. But something had happened to Chris. Hell, something may have happened to the entire city. Over the past couple of weeks, the growing suspicion that her brother was in trouble had become a certainty, and the calls she'd made that morning had cinched it for her. Nobody home. Nobody home anywhere. Lake Raccoon moved and forgot to leave a forwarding address. It was definitely creepy, although she could give a shit about Raccoon. What mattered was that Chris was there, and if something bad had happened to him, she wouldn't think that way. Chris was all she had left. Their father had been killed on his construction job when they were both still kids, and when their mother had died in a car crash 3 years ago, Chris had done his best to take on a parental role. Even though he was only a few years older, he'd helped her pick a college, find a decent therapist. He even sent her a little money each month beyond what the insurance policies paid out, what he called walking around cash. And on top of all that, he called her every couple of weeks, like clockwork. Except he hadn't called at all in the last month and a half, and hadn't returned any of her calls. She'd tried to convince herself that she was silly to worry. Maybe he'd finally met a girl, or something had turned up on the STARS suspension thing, whatever that was about. But after 3 unanswered calls and days of waiting for the phone to ring, she'd finally put in a call to the RPD that very afternoon, hoping against hope that someone there might know what was going on. She'd gotten a busy signal. Sitting in her dorm room, listening to that soulless mechanical bleat, she'd started to worry for real. Even a small city like Raccoon had a voicemail answering system set up to field calls. The rational part of her mind told her not to panic, that a downed line was nothing to get freaky about, but already her emotional self was screaming foul. She'd gone through her address book with trembling hands, dialing the few numbers she had for friends of his, people or places he told her to call if there was ever an emergency and he wasn't at home. Barry Burton, Emmy's Diner, some cop she'd never met named David Ford. She even tried Billy Rabbitson's number, although Chris had told her that he'd disappeared a few months earlier. And with the exception of an overloaded answering machine at David Ford's house, she'd gotten nothing but busy signals. By the time she'd hung up, the worry had transformed into something close to panic. The trip to Raccoon City was only about 6.5 hours from the university. Claire's roommate had borrowed her riding gear to go out with her new biker boyfriend, but Claire had an extra helmet. And with that feeling that was not quite panic spinning through her frightened thoughts, she had simply grabbed the helmet and gone. The last of the day's light was draining from the strip of cloudless sky above, although a waxing, nearly full moon in the Softail's headlight gave her enough light to see by, more than enough to see the small sign ahead on her left. Raccoon City, 10. Telling herself that Chris was fine, that if anything weird had happened in Raccoon, somebody would have checked it out by now. Claire forced her concentration back to handling the heavy bike. It would be full dark soon, but she'd be in Raccoon before it was too dark to ride safely. Whether or not Raccoon City would be safe, she'd find out soon enough. Leon reached the outskirts of town with 20 minutes to spare, but decided that a hot dinner was going to have to wait. From his previous visits to the station, he knew that there were a couple of vending machines he could hit up for something to tide him over. The thought of stale candy and peanuts didn't sit well with his growling stomach, but it was his own damn fault for not taking New York traffic into account. The drive into the city proper did a lot to soothe his still rattled nerves. He passed the few small farms that lay east of the town, the fairgrounds and storage sheds, and finally the truck stop that marked the separation of rural Raccoon from urban. Something about knowing that he was going to be patrolling those back roads before long, keeping them safe, gave him a surprising sense of well-being and a little pride. The early autumn air from the open window was pleasantly brisk, and the rising moon bathed everything he saw in a silvery glow. He wasn't going to be late after all. Within the hour, he'd officially become one of Raccoon's finest. As Leon turned the Jeep down Baby, heading for one of the main north-south streets that would take him to the RPD building, he got his first hint that something was very wrong. In the first few blocks, he was mildly surprised. By the fifth, he found himself slipping towards a state of shock. It wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Bybee was the first real city street, coming from the east, where buildings outnumbered empty lots. There were several espresso bars and cheap diners, as well as a bargain movie theater that never seemed to run anything but horror movies and sexy comedies, and was therefore the most popular hangout for the youth of Raccoon. There were even a few generically hip taverns that served microbrew and hot rum drinks for the winter college student ski crowd. At 8:45 on a Saturday night, Bybee should have been teeming with life. But of the mostly single or two-story brick shops and restaurants that lined the street, Leon saw that almost all were dark, and in the few that still boasted some light, it didn't look like there was anyone inside. There were plenty of cars parked along the narrow street, and yet not one person that he could see. Bybee, the hangout for cruising teens and college students, was totally deserted. Where the hell is everybody? His mind grasped for answers as he crept down the silent street, searching desperately for a reason, and for some way to alleviate the sweaty anxiety that had once again settled over him. Maybe there was some kind of an event going on, a church function, spaghetti feed, or perhaps Raccoon had decided to take up Oktoberfest, and tonight was the big kickoff. But everybody at the same time? It'd have to be one hell of a party. It was then that Leon realized he also hadn't seen a single car on the road since he'd had the scare with the dog 10 miles out of town. Not one. And with that thoroughly unsettling realization came the next, less dramatic, but distinctly more immediate. Something smelled bad. In fact, something smelled like shit. He'd already slowed the Jeep to a crawl and had planned to take a left on Powell just a block ahead. But that horrible smell and the total absence of life were giving him a serious case of the creeps. Maybe he should stop and check things out, look around for some sign of life. Oh, hey! Leon grinned, relief floating through his confusion. There were a couple of people standing at the corner, practically right in front of him. The streetlight was out on their side, but he could see them in silhouette clear enough. A couple. A woman in a skirt and a big man wearing work boots. As he got closer, he could see by the way they moved, heading south on Powell, that they had to be monumentally drunk. Both of them staggered into the shadows cast by an office supply store and out of sight. But he was going in that direction anyways. No harm in stopping to ask what was going on, was there? Must have come out of O'Kelly's. A pint or two too many. But as long as they're not driving anywhere, fine by me. Am I going to feel stupid when they tell me that tonight's the big free concert of the all-you-can-eat town barbecue? Almost giddy with relief, Leon turned the corner and squinted into the heavy shadows, looking for the pair. He didn't see them, but there was an alley tucked between the supply store and a jewelry shop. Maybe his two drunk friends had ducked in for a bathroom break, or something even less legal. Shit! Leon slammed on the brake as a half-dozen dark shapes fluttered up from the street, caught in the Jeep's headlights like giant whirling leaves. Startled, it took him a second to realize he was seeing birds. They didn't cry out, although he was close enough to hear the brushing of dry wings as they took to the air. Crows, enjoying a late-night feast of roadkill. What looked like... my God. There was a human body in the middle of the road, 20 feet in front of the Jeep, face down, but it looked like a woman, and judging from the liquid red stains that covered most of the once white blouse, it wasn't some beer-happy college student who decided to take a nap in the wrong place. Hit and run. Some bastard hit her and then drove off. Leon killed the engine and was half out the door before his racing thoughts caught him up. He hesitated, one foot on the asphalt, the stench of death heavy in the cool, still air. His mind had latched on to an idea that he didn't want to consider, but knew he had better. What if it's not a hit and run? What if there's no one around because some psycho gunman decided on a little target practice? Everyone could be inside, laying low. Maybe the RPD's on the way. And maybe those drunks weren't drunk. They could have been shot and were trying to get help. He leaned back into the Jeep and fumbled under the passenger seat for his graduation gift. A Desert Eagle 50 AE Magnum with a custom 10-inch barrel, Israeli export. His father and uncle, both cops, had gone in together on it. Not standard issue for the RPD. In fact, much more powerful. As Leon gripped a clip from the glove box and slapped it in, feeling the solid weight of the weapon in his slightly unsteady hand, he decided it was the best present he'd ever received. He stuffed 2 more clips into a belt pouch on general principle. Each only held 6 shots. Pointing the loaded Magnum at the ground, he stepped out of the Jeep and took a quick look at his surroundings. He wasn't all that familiar with Raccoon at night, but he knew it shouldn't be as dark as it was. Several of the streetlights further along Powell were either shot out or simply not on, and the shadows past the blood-soaked body were thick. If not for the Jeep's headlights, he wouldn't have even been able to see that. He edged forward, feeling horribly exposed as he left the relative cover of the Jeep, but aware that she could still be alive. It didn't seem likely, but he had to at least check. A few steps closer, and he could see that it was definitely a young woman. Lank red hair obscured the face, but the clothes were right. Denim pedal pushes and flats. The wounds were mostly hidden by the bloody shirt, but there seemed to be dozens. Ragged holes in the wet cloth exposed torn, glistening flesh and the crimson of muscle beneath. Swallowing heavily, Leon quickly switched the gun to his left hand and crouched down next to her. The cool, clammy skin yielded easily beneath his fingertips as he touched her throat. A few seconds passed, seconds that made him feel horribly young and afraid as he tried to remember the procedure for CPR and prayed, at the same time, that he would find a pulse. He couldn't find it, and didn't want to wait one more second. He tucked the Magnum into his belt and grabbed her shoulders to turn her over, to check for breathing. But as he started to lift, He saw something that made him lay her down again, his heart a twisting knot in his chest. The victim's shirt had pulled up out of her pants enough for him to see that his spine and part of her rib cage were exposed, the still fleshy knobs of vertebrae shining in red. The narrow, curving ribs disappeared into masses of shredded tissue. It was like she'd been knocked down and chewed on. Information that Leon had disregarded as unimportant suddenly registered. And even as the few facts he had clicked into place, he felt the first inky tendrils of real fear slither into his mind. The crows couldn't have done this. Would have taken them hours. And who the hell ever heard of crows flocking after dark to eat? And that shit smell. It's not coming from her. She died recently. Cannibal murders. No way. For that to happen, for a person to have been killed and then partially devoured on a city street with no one to stop it, and with enough time to pass for scavengers to come, for that to happen, the killers would have to slaughter most, if not all, of the population. It doesn't seem likely. Well, fine. Then what's that smell? And where is everybody? Behind Leon, there was a low, soft groan, a shuffling footstep, and another sound, a wet sound. It took him barely a second to stand and turn, hand instinctively snatching for the magnum. It was the couple, the drunks, staggering toward him, and they'd been joined by a third, a beefy-looking guy with blood all over his shirt and his hands, and dripping out of his mouth. A rubbery, red mouth set into his pasty, rotting face like an open sore. The other man, the big man with the work boots and suspenders, looked much the same, and the V of the blonde woman's pink blouse revealed cleavage that was spotted with darkness, with what appeared to be mold. The trio stumbled towards him, past his jeep, raising pale hands as they emitted mourning, hungry wails. Some dark fluid gurgled out of the beefy man's nose and ran across his moving lips, and Leon was overwhelmed by the understanding that the terrible, shitty smell was decayed flesh. And it was coming from them. And there was another, stepping out from a door stoop across the street, a young woman in a stained t-shirt, hair tied back from a slack and mindless face. A groan from behind him. Leon shot a look over his shoulder, saw a youth with dark hair and rotting arms shamble out from the sidewalk darkness of an awning shadow. Leon raised the magnum and aimed it at the closest, the man with suspenders, while his instinct screamed at him to run. He was terrified, but his trained logic continued to insist that there was an explanation for what he was seeing, that he was not looking at the walking dead. Control, procedure, you're a cop. All right, that's far enough. Don't move. His voice was strong, commanding, and authoritative, and he was wearing his uniform. And God, why wouldn't they stop? The man in suspenders moaned again, blind to the weapon pointed at his chest, and still flanked by the others, now less than 10 feet away. "Don't move," said Leon again, and the sound of his own panic made him back up a step, darting his gaze left and right, seeing that there was still more of the wailing, lurching people coming out of the shadows. Something grabbed his ankle. "No!" he shouted, whipping the gun around, and saw that the corpse of the hit-and-run victim was scraping at his boot with one blood-crusted hand, working to drag her crippled body closer. Her gasping cry of frantic hunger rose to join those of the others as she tried to bite into his foot. Bloody smears of saliva drooling off her abraded chin, dripping onto the leather. Leon fired into her upper back, the sharp, explosive crack of the massive weapon loosening her grip, and at such a close range, probably obliterating her heart. Spasming, she dropped back to the pavement. And he turned and saw that the others were less than 5 feet away, and he fired twice more, the rounds splattering red flowers into the chest of the closest. The entry wounds sprouted scarlet. The man in suspenders was hardly fazed by the twin gaping holes in his torso. He staggered, faltering only for a second. He opened his bloody mouth and gasped out a hissing mewl of hunger, his hands raised again as if to direct him to the source of relief. Must be on something. Firepower like that could drop an elephant. Backing away, Leon fired again. And again, and again, and the empty clattered to the pavement. Another was slammed in, more rounds fired, and they still kept coming, oblivious to the shots that ripped at their stinking flesh. It was a bad dream, a bad movie. It wasn't real, and Leon knew that if he didn't start believing, he was going to die, eaten alive by these... Go ahead, Kennedy. Say it. These zombies. Blocked from his jeep, Leon stumbled away, still firing. So much for the nightlife. This place is Deadsville. Claire had seen a couple of people wandering around as she pulled into Raccoon, though not nearly as many as there should have been. In fact, the place seemed spectacularly deserted. The helmet blocked out a lot of visual evidence, but there was definitely a lack of business going on at the east end of town. A lack of traffic as well. It struck her as weird, but considering the disasters she'd been imagining all afternoon, not all that ominous. Raccoon still existed, and as she headed for the 24-hour diner off Powell, she saw a fairly large group of partiers walking down the middle of a side street. Drunken frat boys, if she remembered her last visit clearly. Obnoxious, but hardly the horsemen of the apocalypse. No bombed-out ruins, no dying fires, no air raid sirens. So far, so good. She planned to head straight for Chris's apartment before she realized that she'd be passing Emmy's on the way. Chris couldn't cook worth a damn. Consequently, he lived on cereal, cold sandwiches, and dinner at Emmy's about 6 nights a week. Even if he wasn't there, it might be worth it to stop in and ask one of the waitresses if they'd seen him lately. As Claire pulled the Softail to a gentle stop in front of Emmy's, she noticed a couple of rats scurrying for cover from atop a garbage can on the sidewalk. She put down the stand and unstraddled the bike, taking off her helmet and setting it on the warm seat. Shaking out her ponytail, she wrinkled her nose in disgust. From the smell of things, the trash had been sitting out for quite a while. Whatever they were throwing away gave off a seriously toxic stink. Before going in, she chafed her bare legs and arms lightly, as much to warm them up as to wipe off the layer of road grime. Shorts and a vest were no match for the October night, and it reminded her once again of how dumb she'd been to ride bare. Chris would give her one hell of a lecture. The building's glass front gave her a clear look at the well-lit, homely restaurant. From the bolted red stools at the lunch counter to the padded booze lining the walls. And there wasn't a soul in sight. Claire frowned, her initial disappointment giving way to confusion. Having visited Chris pretty regularly over the last few years, she'd been out to the diner at all hours of the day and night. They were both night owls, often deciding to go out for cheeseburgers at 3 a.m, which meant Emmy's every time. And there was always someone at Emmy's, chatting with one of the pink polyester-clad waitresses or hunched over a cup of coffee with a newspaper, no matter what time it was. So where are they? It's not even 9 o'clock. The sign said open, and she wasn't going to find out standing in the street. With a last glance at her bike, she opened the door and stepped inside. Taking a deep breath, she called out hopefully, "Hello? Anyone here?" Her voice seemed somehow flat in the muted silence of the empty restaurant, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fans overhead, There wasn't a sound. There was the familiar smell of stale grease in the air, but something else, too. A scent that was bitter and yet soft, like rotting flowers. The restaurant was L-shaped, booths stretching off in front of her and to the left. Walking slowly, Claire headed straight. At the end of the lunch counter was the wait station, and past that the kitchen. If Emmy's was open, the staff would probably be hanging out there, maybe as surprised as she was that there were no customers. Except that wouldn't explain the mess, would it? It wasn't a mess exactly. The disorder was subtle enough that she hadn't even noticed it from outside. A few menus on the floor, an overturned water glass on the counter, and a couple of randomly strewn pieces of silverware were the only signs of something amiss. But they were enough. To hell with checking out the kitchen. This is too weird. Something is seriously fucked up in this city, or maybe they got robbed, or maybe they're setting up for a surprise party. Who cares? Time for you to be elsewhere. From the hidden space at the end of the counter, she heard a gentle sound of movement, a sliding whisper of cloth followed by a muffled grunt. Somebody was there, ducked down. Heart thumping loudly, Claire called out again. "Hello?" For a beat, there was nothing, and then another grunt, a muted moan that raised the hair on the back of her neck. In spite of her misgivings, Claire hurried towards the back, suddenly feeling childish for her desire to leave. Maybe there had been a robbery, maybe the customers had been tied up and gagged, or even worse, so badly injured that they couldn't cry out. Like it or not, she was involved. Claire reached the end of the counter, pivoted left, and froze, eyes wide, feeling as though she'd been physically slapped. Next to a cart loaded with trays was a balding man dressed in cook's whites, his back to her. He was crouched over the body of a waitress, but there was something very wrong about her. So wrong that Claire's mind couldn't quite accept it at first. Her shocked gaze took in the pink uniform, the walking shoes, even the plastic name tag still pinned to the woman's chest. What looked like Julie or Julia. Her head is missing. Once Claire realized what was wrong, she couldn't force herself to unrealize it, as much as she wanted to. There was only a pool of drying blood where the waitress's head should have been, a sticky puddle surrounded by fragments of skull and dark-mashed hair, chunks of miscellaneous gore. The cook had his hands over his face, and as Claire stared in horror at the headless corpse, he let out a low, pitiful wail. Claire opened her mouth, not sure what would come out. To scream, to ask him why, how, to offer to call for help. She honestly didn't know. And as the man turned to look up at her, hands dropping away, she was stunned to hear that nothing came out at all. He was eating the waitress. His thick fingers were clotted with dark bits of tissue. The strange and alien face he raised into view was smeared with blood. Zombie. A child of late-night creature features and campfire stories. Her mind accepted it in the split second it took for her to think it. She wasn't an idiot. He was deathly pale and ripe with that sickly sweet scent of decay she'd noticed earlier, his eyes cataracted and gleaming white. Zombies in raccoon. Never expected that. With that calm, logical realization came a sudden rush of absolute terror. Claire stumbled forwards, feverish panic turning her guts into liquid as the cook continued to turn, rising from his crouch. He was huge, easily a foot over her, and broad as a barn. And dead. He's dead, and he was eating her. Don't let him get any closer. The cook took a step towards her, his stained hands clenching into fists. Claire backed up faster, almost slipping on a menu. A fork clattered away from beneath one boot. "Get out now." I'll be on my way now," she babbled. "Really, don't bother to show me out." The cook staggered forward, his blind eyes glowing with dumb hunger. Another step back and Claire reached behind her, felt air, felt nothing, and then the cool metal of the door's handle. A shot of adrenaline bolted through her as she spun, snatched at the handle, and screamed. A short, sharp cry of horror. There were 2, 3 more of them outside. Their disintegrating flesh pressed to the glass front of the diner. One of them had only one eye, a hole where the other should have been. Another had no upper lip. A ragged, permanent grin scrolled across his lower jaw. They clawed mindlessly at the windows, their ashy, ravaged faces awash with blood. And from the shadows across the street, dark shapes stumbled out into the open. "Can't get out. Trapped. The back door." From the edge of her vision, the glowing green exit sign shone like a beacon. Claire spun again and barely saw the cook reaching out to her from a few feet away, her full attention fixating on the only hope of escape. She ran, the boost whipping by in a flash of on-scene color, her arms pumping for speed. The door opened out into the alley. She was going to hit it running, and if it was locked, she was screwed. Claire slammed into the door, and it flew open, crashing into the brick wall of the alley. And there was a gun pointed at her face. The only thing that could possibly stop her at that second. A man with a gun. She froze, raised her arms instinctively as if to ward off a blow. "Wait! Don't shoot!" The gunman didn't move, the deadly-looking weapon still aimed at her head. "Gonna kill me? Get down!" the gunman shouted, and Claire dropped, her knees buckling as much from the command as from the cold fingertips suddenly groping at her shoulder. The gunman fired, and Claire snapped her head around, saw the dead cook falling backwards from directly behind her, at least one massive hole now in its forehead. Sluggish spurts of blood jetted from the wound, the white eyes filming over with red. The falling corpse twitched, once, twice, and stopped moving. Claire turned back to the man who'd saved her life, and his uniform registered for the first time. Cop. He was a young, tall, and almost as terrified-looking as she felt cop. His voice, at least, was strong and sure as he reached down to help her. "We can't stay here. Come with me. We'll be a lot safer at the police station." As he spoke, she could hear a closing chorus of gasping moans from the street, the wails of hunger growing louder. Claire let herself be pulled up, gripping his hand tightly, taking small comfort in the fact that his fingers were as feverish and shaky as hers. They ran, dodging dumpsters and heaps of flattened boxes, chased by echoing, haunted cries as the zombies found the dark alley and started after them. Leon ran alongside the girl, desperately racking his memory for the city's downtown layout. The alley should let out on Ash, not far from Oak, the RPD's street. But the station was at least another 15 blocks west. Unless they could find transportation, they weren't going to make it. He was on his last clip, 4 rounds left, and from the sounds reverberating through the alley, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of the creatures at either end. As they reached the mouth of the alley, Leon held up his hand and slowed to a jog, scanning the dimly lit street. He couldn't see much, but from where they stood to the next streetlight, there were 11 or 12 of the creatures to the right, staggering and reeling their way through the stinking darkness. There were only 3 of them to the left, not far from there. Leon pointed at the squad car parked across the street, feeling a flush of wild hope. There were no officers in sight. That would be too much to ask for. But the front doors were standing open, and the 3 moaning things that roamed nearby wouldn't reach it before he and the girl could. Even if there were no keys, there was a radio, and the windshield was bulletproof. They could probably hold out against the walking corpses until help came. And it's the only chance you've got. He hesitated just long enough to see the girl nod, her brown ponytail bobbing, and then they were sprinting for the black and white, the pavement a blur beneath their feet. Leon kept the handgun half pointed towards the creatures closest to them, 50 feet away. He wanted to shoot, to keep them from getting one step closer, but he couldn't afford to waste the ammo. Let there be keys. They reached the car at the same time and split, the girl running around to the passenger side, and Leon realized with a new kind of horror that she probably thought the car was his. He waited for her to slam the door before jumping behind the wheel, a small, deeply frightened part of him screaming that this was his first day as he yanked his own door shut. A prayer answered. The keys were in the ignition. Leon dropped the Magnum into his lap and grabbed them, feeling that wild hope once again, like there were options besides dying. "Buckle up," he said as he turned the keys and the flashes came on. Ash Street and the creatures that stalked it were bathed in blue and red swirls of pallid color, shadows changing form and thickness. It was a vision of hell, and he hit the gas, desperate to get away from it as fast as he could. The car spun away from the curb with a squeal. Leon pulled the wheel right and then left, narrowly missing a lurching woman whose scalp had been torn half off. Even through the closed windows, he could hear her frustrated howl as they sped away, joined by the cries of many more. Backup. Call for backup. Leon fumbled for the radio, not taking his gaze off the road. The creatures were scattered but persistent, dark and shambling monsters that staggered out into the street as if drawn to the sound of the speeding car. As the black and white rocketed across Powell and continued on, he had to dodge several more of them. The girl was talking, staring out at the desolate landscape as Leon hit the calm button on the radio, his sense of helplessness rising. No static. Nothing. "What the hell's going on?" the girl was saying. "I arrive in Raccoon, and the whole place is insane." "Great. The radio's out," Leon interrupted, dropping the radio and focusing on the road. The entire city seemed like an alien world, the streets strangely shadowed. There was a dreamlike quality to it, but the smell kept him from believing that he was asleep. The stench of diseased flesh had permeated even the interior of the squad car, making it hard to concentrate on driving. At least there was no traffic and no people. Well, no real people. Except me and the girl. I've got to do my job here. Keep her from getting hurt. Poor kid. She can't be older than 19 or 20. She's probably terrified. I've got to keep it together and shield her from further danger here. Get her to the station and... You're a cop, right? The girl's lilting but somehow sarcastic tones snapped him out of his panicked musings. He shot a look in her direction, noting that while she looked pale, she didn't seem to be quivering or on the edge of a breakdown. There was even a trace of humor in her clear gray eyes, and Leon got a sudden strong impression that she wasn't the breakdown type. A very good thing, considering the circumstances. First day on the job. Great, huh? I'm Leon Kennedy. Claire, she said. Claire Redfield. I came to find my brother Chris. She trailed off, staring back out at the passing street. Two of the creatures were staggering into the path of the car from either side, but Leon hit the gas and managed to drive between them. The steel mesh screen separating the back compartment was down, giving him a clear look from the rear-view mirror. The two shuffling ghouls were now plodding mindlessly after him. Hungry, just like the movies. For a moment, neither spoke, the obvious question remaining unspoken. Whatever had happened to turn Raccoon into a horror show didn't matter as much as how they were going to survive it. They'd be at the station in a couple minutes, assuming the road stayed clear. There was an underground parking lot. He'd try that first. But if the gates were closed, they'd have to cover a short distance on foot. There was a small courtyard in front of the building, a park area. 4 rounds left, and maybe a city full of those things. We need another weapon. Hey, open the glove box, he said. Claire tapped the button and reached inside, revealing the back of her pink sleeveless vest. The legend, "Made in Heaven," was appliqued above a voluptuous posing angel holding a bomb. The outfit suited her. There's a gun inside, she said, and pulled out a sleek semi-automatic. She raised it carefully and checked to see if it was loaded before digging out a couple of clips. It was one of the RPD's old issue, a 9mm Browning HP. Since the slew of recent murders, the Raccoon Force had been carrying H&K VP-70s, another 9mm. The difference was that the Browning could only hold 13, while the newer issues held 18 rounds, 19 if you kept one chambered. From the way she handled it, Leon could tell she knew what she was doing. Better take it with you, he said. The RPD kept a decent arsenal. Assuming that there were still cops around, he could pick up his assigned weapon and why are you assuming anything? As Leon took the corner of Ash and 3rd a little too quickly, the realization finally hit him that the station itself might be crawling with corpses. Everything was happening so fast, he just hadn't considered the possibility. He straightened out the car and let up on the gas, trying to come up with an alternate plan as calmly and rationally as he could. Maybe there was an organized defense at the station, but it wasn't easy to feel hopeful with the stink of decay so heavy in the air. We have 3/4 of a tank, more than enough to make it over the mountains. We could be in Latham in less than an hour. They could drive by the station, and if it looked unfriendly, just get the hell out of town. Sounded good to him. He started to tell Claire, see what she thought, when the horrible smell of slaughter washed over him and something lunged out of the back seat. Claire screamed, and the monster that had been in the squad car all along grasped Leon's shoulder with icy hands, its fly-blown breath gusting into his face. It snatched at his right arm, pulling it towards its drool-slick teeth with inhuman strength. "No!" Leon shouted as the car veered wildly to the right, jumping the curb and sliding towards a brick building. The creature was unbalanced, losing some of its grip. Leon jerked the wheel, but too late to avoid the wall completely. Metal shrieked, and a brilliant flash of sparks illuminated the groping hands and leering ghoulish grins of the passenger as the speeding car shot back out into the street. The dead thing swung its eager arms at Claire, and without thinking, Leon slammed on the gas and pulled a hard right. The car fishtailed, the back end crunching against a parked pickup truck, and another burst of fiery sparks. The drooling corpse fell back into the padded seat, but immediately pulled forward again, gnashing its teeth and clawing for the girl. The squad car sped down 3rd, Leon trying to control the wheel as he grabbed his weapon and half-turned, holding the magnum by the barrel. He didn't think to take his foot off the gas, couldn't think of anything except that the zombie was about to sink its teeth into Claire's struggling shoulder. He brought the heavy weapon down and across his face, the butt sliding across flesh, and peeled away its thick flaps. Blood gushed from the wound as the grips crushed into the nose, cartilage separating from bone with a wet crunch. Gurgling, the creature clutched at its bleeding head, and Leon just had time to feel a second's triumph when Claire screamed, "Look out!" And Leon looked up to see that they were about to crash. Leon hit the zombie with his gun, and Claire instinctively flinched from the splatter of blood, her horrified gaze finding that the street they were on was about to end. "Look out!" She caught just a glimpse of his white knuckles on the wheel, his clenched jaw, and then the car was spinning, screeching, buildings and streetlights flashing by so fast that all she saw was a blur. There was an explosion of sound, of glass shattering and metal compressing as the cop car slammed into something solid, throwing Claire against her safety belt. The impact hurled the zombie forward at the same time, and Claire reflexively threw her arms up as the dead thing crashed through the windshield. And then everything was still. There was only the ticking of hot metal, the sound of her own heart thundering in her ears. Claire brought her arms down and saw that Leon had already recovered, was already staring at the bloody, broken mess sprawled across the hood, its head hanging mercifully out of sight. It wasn't moving. "You okay?" Claire turned and looked at Leon, suddenly having to fight off a semi-hysterical laughing fit. Raccoon had been taken over by the living dead, and they'd just been in a serious car wreck because a corpse had been trying to eat them. All things considered, okay was not the first word to come to mind. At the sight of Leon's sincere and stricken expression, the urge to freak out passed. He looked on the edge of a fit himself. Allowing her devastated nerves free rein wouldn't help anything. "Still in one piece," she managed, and the young cop nodded, seemingly relieved. Claire took a deep breath, feeling like it was the first she'd taken in hours, and looked around at where they'd ended up. Leon had managed a complete 180 at the very end of the street where it teed, the totaled squad car facing back the way they'd come. There were no zombies in the immediate vicinity, but Claire had the feeling that they wouldn't have long to find cover. From what she'd seen so far, most, if not all of Raccoon had been affected by whatever it was that had happened. She held the handgun tightly, trying to get her tangled emotions under control. Leon started to say something and then stopped, his eyes widening. For a second, Claire could only think that at some point since she'd left the university, she'd been cursed. A semi was barreling down the street, still several blocks away, but close enough for them to see that it was out of control. The truck veered back and forth, smashing against a blue pickup parked on one side of the street and then plowing over a mailbox on the other. Claire realized with numb horror that it was a tanker, and from the way the hull was sliding dangerously at each frantic swerve, the driver had a full load. In the split second that it took her to digest that information, to pray that it wasn't gas or oil, the tanker had halved the distance between them. She could actually see the flames painted across the dark green cab, but even then it wasn't real until Leon broke their stunned silence. "Maniac's going to ram us," he breathed. And then they were both stabbing at the seatbelt releases, Claire praying that the crash hadn't locked them somehow. The sound of the belts letting go were inaudible beneath the rising monolithic growl of the oncoming tanker and the echoing crunch of cars being sideswiped left and right. It would be on them in a heartbeat. "Run!" Leon shouted, and then she was pushing her way out of the squad car, cool air against her sweaty skin and the scream of the truck's engines blocking out everything else. impulse. She took 3 giant running leaps and then felt as much as heard the impact, the asphalt shaking beneath her feet, even as the crash of rending metal thundered behind her. One more flying step, and she was being pushed, shoved roughly off her feet by an incredible pressure wave of heat and sound. She managed to kick off the ground as the tanker's explosion turned night to day in one brilliant instant. An awkward shoulder roll, grit biting into her heat-blasted skin, and she landed behind a parked car in a gasping heap. Brief, clattering rain of smoking debris, and Claire was on her feet, stumbling back into the street to search the towering flames for some sign of Leon. Her heart sank. The tanker, squad car, and what had once been a hardware store were all enveloped in an inferno of chemical fire, the street completely blocked by the mass of twisted, burning destruction. Claire? Leon's voice, muffled but audible through the wall of curling flame. Leon? I'm okay, he shouted. Head to the station. I'll meet you there. Claire hesitated for a second, staring down at the handgun she still held tightly in one shaky hand. She was afraid, scared of being alone in a city that had turned into a living graveyard. But it wasn't like there was much of a choice. Wishing that circumstances were different was a waste of time. She turned, trying to get her bearings by the smoking, flickering light of the wreck. The station was close, a couple blocks away, and there were creatures lurching out of the shadow from behind cars and inside darkened buildings. With single-minded purpose, they shambled into the strange light of the blazing accident, making small sounds of hunger as they came. 2, 3, 4 of them. She saw tattered skin and rotting limbs, gaping blackness where eyes should be. And still they came, moving slowly towards her, as if homing in on living flesh. Beyond the fiery wreck, she heard gunfire. 2 shots from perhaps a block away, then nothing. Nothing but the crackle of consuming flames and the soft, helpless cries of the shuffling dead. Leon's on his own now. Move! Claire took a deep breath, spotted an opening within the lethal crowd closing in on her, and ran.